Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Ukrainian show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and I have a privilege to have Dr. Jonathan Lockwood, and I will have a little bit of time with him one-on-one, and all my questions will,
Oh, goody.
by
You don't have to
default,
worry about who you're going to toss the question to today.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
only me.
It's only you, there's no one else. Jonathan, what I'd like to mention is that we discussed several times that, of course, outcome of this war will be decided on the battlefield. And that's what's happening now as we speak. However, I would like to mention there are some other dimensions in that war. Of course, it's psychological, it's social media, information war, and so on. And that indirectly, I'll explain how, in my opinion, it affects the battlefield war. Because if there are so many useful idiots in Europe, in the United States, including lately CNN, that publish the absolutely ridiculous information that Ukrainian offensive is too slow and probably will not result in anything or so on. We are
How would they know?
Okay, exactly, Jonathan. There are two kinds of information. One is available to large audience who don't know nothing better than to listen to this talking heads who isn't clear what level of information they have, where does it get it from, or so on. Why don't we go to the source? I would like to mention the interview with Brigadier General Patrick Ryder, Pentagon spokesman, answering whether it was realistic to expect that the armed forces of Ukraine would be able to master the style of maneuver warfare in a short period of the exercises. The general said that he was not going to stand on the podium and guess the actions of the commander of the Ukrainian army in a front line. Let's take a step back and admit that this is not an ideal situation. No one in their right mind would ever want Russia to invade Ukraine, but it did happen, Ryder added. He says the Ukrainians, despite everything, were able to push the Russians back to defensive positions, which is a miracle given the state of the Ukrainian army at the time of the Russian invasion. So this, we are talking about highly placed official in Pentagon, and that's his view of what's happening. So what nonsense are CNN, what they're creating as being useful idiots of Putin and FSB, they're creating a situation where there is a piecemeal efforts to provide help to Ukrainians, but it's happening several months after the subject has been decided. There are a lot of indecisions. Now there is saying that Biden hasn't made up his mind whether it's not HIMARS, but the ATACMS missiles and F-16s or whatever. Well, I'd like to be, Jonathan, if you will understand what I'm talking about. Let's assume that all help of the West and the United States to Ukraine in last, say, year and a half since the beginning of the war was, let's make it simple, $50 billion, give or take, okay? Now, if it's all done instantly and you get all the ammunition, the artillery, the F-16s and everything else, so Ukraine would win this war in a matter of 2 weeks. Even today. Now, okay, the analogy could be, okay, let's see my 5 fingers. Okay, I can do some damage with one of these fingers and with another one, and maybe this one is not so strong, this one is rather weak. However, you know what? If I will have a fist and I will punch somebody with all my fist, in the face, that could create a certain effect. It's gonna work, unlike my separate fingers. So the same as Ukraine, if it would have everything right now, it would punch Russians. It probably would even they wouldn't probably even bother so much with this front lines, this minefields or so on. They would use ATACMS just to destroy the third line. Of the Russian fortifications and go even much farther. And they would probably already get rid of the Crimean Bridge. Although some people argue that they should keep at least one line open for Russian occupiers to run uh, back to their country using this remaining line of the bridge. So, Jonathan, let me have your opinion on what's being discussed where information war can affect the real war in the warfare, if in the trenches, because if for that, uh, mind you, Russians, as you know, they have a great experience in information war because for the last 100 years they did nothing but lying to their own people, to the West, or so on. So they are grandmasters of lies. And because of they have enormous amount of money available, so their propaganda machine works. Let's admit that. But we have to care about a real thing, how to make sure that the Russian aggression will not be unpunished.
Well, after after that long leading question,
Yeah,
the fact is that the West did not plan for, nor was it planned for, giving a rapid reinforcement of weaponry and material to Ukraine because they did not think it would be. No, one, they didn't think it would be needed. They weren't sure that Ukraine could survive the initial onslaught. They were
I,
surprised by that, and so then said, "Okay, well, let's give them some more material and see what happens." And the Ukrainians made the absolute most of what they were given. And so they were able to halt the Russian offensive. They were able to take back territory. They were able to now absorb the amount of material and weaponry that they've been given and even mount a modest, admittedly slow moving counteroffensive, but it is a counteroffensive which is tailored to Ukrainian tactics and Ukrainian doctrine and capability, not to Western capability. Another Pentagon spokesman pointed out that we should not judge the Ukrainian success or lack or seeming lack thereof based upon our own standards. The Ukrainians do not have the built-in material superiority that the United States would have or NATO would have naturally on hand in conducting warfare according to their doctrine. So the Ukrainians have simply tailored what they have to their offensive. They are, again, as I mentioned before, use the analogy of a skilled boxer. They are using their offensive capability in a very measured manner to probe for weakness, to keep exploiting opportunities, all the while withholding their main reserve until they find the optimum opportunity to exploit that, create an operational breakthrough, which, in my opinion, the key objective in this particular phase would be to sever the link between Crimea and Russia. Once that is achieved, the mind you that the Russians may still be occupying other areas of Ukraine, but they will have lost the main thing for which they wanted to wage this war to begin with. They wanted to achieve the complete domination of Ukraine. Well, not only will they have failed at that, but they will have lost the main thing they gained back in 2014. They will have lost the Crimea. That will be very, very visible. No amount of information operations or propaganda on the part of Russia will be able to convince the world that they have not been thoroughly beaten on the battlefield, and that the world will be calling in that case for at the very least an armistice, a ceasefire. They can achieve that, and then the Ukrainians will have a free hand to continue to follow up on the success of their offensive by driving the Russians out of the rest of Ukraine, because the Russian morale will have been severely damaged, even worse than it is now. I mean, so I think it is very premature for any Western analyst to say that, well, the Ukrainian counteroffensive is not moving as fast as we anticipated it would, therefore that it's failed. Yeah, no, it's not.
Mhm.
So yeah, the Ukrainians still have the initiative. They have the initiative. They have the reserves. They have have kept husbanded their strength for mounting a for the right time to launch the decisive blow that will create that operational victory on the battlefield. And that operational victory on the battlefield, severing Crimea from Russia, will therefore lead to greater political support for Ukraine and greater pressure on Russia to cut their losses, call it a day, go back to their original lines, go back to their pre-war borders, and just accept for right now the shall I say the gaining of Ukrainian independence from Russia and the loss of Russian aspirations for restoring the Russian Empire, as at least the way Putin sees it.
Gentlemen, I'm following the source of Ukrainian Pravda, Ukrainian Truth. And they're very diligent in reporting of losses. They don't disclose, unfortunately, Ukrainian losses, or maybe fortunately. But Russian losses, both in soldiers and their aircrafts and everything else, they're very detailed every day. For example, yesterday there were 580 80 men or soldiers, or we'll discuss it, what's the right name for this Russian invaders. They were, okay, I'm not going to say killed, I will say liquidated. Would that be kind of a nicer?
You could say eliminated.
Eliminated. Okay, I'm trying to polish my presentation, because normally when I'm saying that the goal of Ukrainian army is to kill as many Russian soldiers as possible, it may be nicer
That's
to
it. I joke.
eliminate.
You and I joked once that we could make an entire
I know.
program of just out of just saying that.
Exactly. So we'll leave to our listeners to decide whether they are being eliminated or liquidated, or what's better. Eliminated probably is a nicer and kinder word. Yeah.
It's a good wargaming term.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So eliminated. Now, among those lines, there were of course liquidated and eliminated as well. 12 tanks, 15 BPLA, the uh, 15 artillery systems, 16 transport means like cisterns for gasoline or so on. So now, if it's happening every day, mind you, months, probably 2 months ago, the number was never below 1,100 a day being eliminated. But it was times of Russian offensive in Bakhmut. So they were throwing people like unlimited supply of kind of a material. And now speaking about material, let's assume, just for an example, that Ukraine lost just as many soldiers as Russians. Nobody knows real numbers, but let's assume that it's the same. Now, let's talk about not quantity, but the quality of people dying in their armies. In Ukraine, we are talking about cream of the cream of Ukrainian society. It's a well-educated patriots who are fighting for integrity of their country. In Russia, what people are going hell to Russian army? Okay, we know about all inmates from jails. We know about people from the outskirts of cities, and not I'm talking about Moscow or St. Petersburg. I'm talking about cities somewhere in Siberia, somewhere very, very poor areas where they have no prospects, they have no jobs, they don't have any way ahead in their lives except the miserable conditions they're living in, that there is no gas, there is no toilets in their flats or apartments or so on. And for them to get paid, say, 200,000 rubles, which is equivalent of $2,000. So this is a motivation. Okay, so maybe I'll die in Ukraine, but at least my family will enjoy this couple of $1,000 here and there. And maybe I will not die, who knows? And so on. So this type of people are being killed on the Russian side. So there is no equality of any kind between people that Ukraine is losing and people that Russia is losing. What would you comment, John?
Well, if that trend continues, yeah, the Ukrainians fortunately are on the defensive and have been careful enough to wage a modest and controlled offensive, counteroffensive. Not they are not squandering, they are not mindlessly squandering Ukrainian lives in fighting the Russians. The Russians are being leadership is very profligate in throwing masses of men and material at the Ukrainians, heedless of the losses. And but the thing is that the quality of the Russian forces that are going to replace, if they are replaced, vis-a-vis the Ukrainians, that quality is not going to go up over time. They're not saving their best for last. They're throwing in what they have. I mean, a lot of the so-called best have either left the country, or they're in hiding, or they are trying to make themselves as unavailable as possible for a Russian-Ukrainian conflict. You know, the Ukrainians, so long as they are able to wage war, wage their counteroffensive as prudently and carefully as possible while keeping up the pressure on the Russian military, the better the chance they have of achieving that operational breakthrough I mentioned and of inflicting a severe enough defeat whereby it will be possible to attain a theater-wide armistice, a theater-wide ceasefire. That should be the realistic objective for the Ukrainian military. And that narrows it down to the focus of severing the link between Russia and Crimea. It becomes just as simple as that. You know, all this talk about the laying of extensive minefields. The Ukrainians do not have to go and clear out every single minefield in
Yeah.
Ukraine. All they have to do is win at decisive points and achieve a significant operational victory. The key to that is the Crimea. Sever the link, and
I
once
think
that's
for Russians, psychological, actually, there are 2 points. One is Crimea, I agree with you, and another one is Bakhmut, because they lost so many people taking Bakhmut, and they were fighting for 9 months to get anywhere.
and
And now
now they're being driven out again.
yeah,
So and they're being isolated and cut off. And Bakhmut is taking on, in an operational sense, as much significance as the town of Baston was during the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. When the
yeah,
Americans successfully held out at Baston and prevented, if you look at all you got to do is look at a map of that area. If you look at a map of the Ardennes and in the particularly area where the Bulge offensive was launched, Baston resembles a giant spider web. It's a road network that all roads practically converge on that. It's if you controlled Baston, then you control the road network, and you would make any subsequent offensive westward a very difficult proposition. Because the Americans held Baston, it greatly impeded the progress of the German offensive and made it impossible for the Germans to really attain their operational objective of getting beyond the Meuse River. And then from there, their objective, as you recall, was penetrating all the way to Antwerp, which was really an almost impossible objective given the German capabilities. But the idea was to get to Antwerp and sever, to cut in half the Allied forces, get to the main port. Yeah, if that could have been attained, well, yeah, they would have had to have taken and held Baston pretty early on in order to have the supply lines to sustain a German offensive that far. They didn't, and therefore they lost. In the case of the Russians with Bakhmut, the Ukrainians were able to successfully convert Bakhmut into the equivalent of Verdun, the World War I battle, where the Germans hoped to bleed the French white in an extensive attritional battle at Verdun. As it turned out, it was a very expensive for both sides, and so it was, you couldn't really call it a victory. But in this case, the Ukrainians have been able to successfully convert the defense of Bakhmut into a means of killing as many Russians as possible, as, as you mentioned, and therefore it increases their material losses. It lowers the quality of any subsequent reinforcements that they can provide, and so the fact that the Ukrainians are now able to, in their in their carefully measured counteroffensive, take advantage of taking back Bakhmut and rendering what little Russian victory they could claim, rendering it irrelevant because the Ukrainians are retaking Bakhmut.
Actually, it's a very smart tactics in Ukrainians. They're not emphasizing the importance of Bakhmut. They almost encircled that, and they're fighting in several other directions and saying Russians, okay, bring more people to Bakhmut. I mean, you have to defend it. We'll give you time. Bring more people.
Yeah.
So, but actually, you had the right point about you see the effectiveness of any army in a long entrenched war of attrition is what we're witnessing now. On the front lines, the effectiveness of soldiers is going down after 1 month and drastically down on the second month. And if they are fighting for more than 3 months on the front lines, I don't believe in usefulness of such an army. They're just thinking about how to survive physically and otherwise rather than fight. So Russians have a great difficulties to reinforce their frontline armies because they need somehow to take back existing soldiers and bring the new ones in. And in the case when Ukrainians have HIMARS and a lot of new artillery possibilities, it's not going to be an easy task for Russians to reinforce their armies. And without that, how capable are they of fighting the war of attrition?
Well, not very, because the Ukrainians have been very effective using the weapons they've been provided in counter battery fire and waging war on Russian artillery. And if they destroy enough Russian artillery, the Russians are going to be unable to conduct even counterattacking in a significant degree, because the Russians have historically placed a great deal of emphasis on artillery. And they did so during World War II, where you would have thousands of guns being used at once against the German positions. And the Germans got to the point where they would have a thin defense up front to delay, and the bulk of their defense would be pulled back out of range of that massed Russian artillery.
Exactly. But okay, speaking about reinforcement, let's see the same Ukrainian Pravda tells us that yesterday 12 Russian tanks were eliminated, and so were 15 BPLA and so many 15 artillery systems. Does it mean that, let's see, if yesterday was Thursday, so on Thursday so much for eliminated, do you think on Friday they will get a new supply of the same 12 tanks and 15 artillery systems?
No,
Probably
it's
not.
the quantity is going to be going down over time too, because that Russia is not prepared, despite their proclamations to the contrary. They are not prepared for a long war. Their capability for waging it is going to be decreasing over time, and the quality of what they can put out there is also going to be decreasing over time. So all the Ukrainians, maybe in a political sense, are in a race against time, because politically, what the Russians are counting on, obviously, is they are counting on next year's presidential elections to win for them, in a political sense, what they could not otherwise win on the battlefield. Now, if that's similar to the Confederate thinking in the American Civil War, even after they had lost the Battle of Gettysburg and could not compel a political victory on the battlefield, they were hoping for a victory by political exhaustion. They were counting on being able to win in a sense by having McClellan as the Democratic candidate. If McClellan were able to defeat Lincoln in the 1864 presidential election, then they were counting on that being able to McClellan being able to negotiate a peace with the Confederates, and they would therefore win de facto independence. But as it turned out, campaigns against the Confederates in Atlanta and so forth were able to prevent that sort of thing from happening. But in any case, this is the sort of thing the Russians are going to try to drag out the war and hopefully achieve through political exhaustion and lack of will on the part of the West to see something through and force an armistice similar to that which ended the Korean War.
Well, so far, in my opinion, yeah, you cannot underestimate chances of change of political leadership in the United States. It could be that I'm trying to say whether Republicans or Donald Trump, because I don't
You
equal
never
Donald Trump to Republicans. They're two completely different things. Republicans is one
you
thing, Donald
you
Trump is.
never know at this point, and uh, don't count on those positions remaining set in stone,
Yes.
and that the Republicans as a whole could be convinced simply by developments on the battlefield. It could be a moot point by the time of the presidential election campaign season next year. The Russian-Ukrainian war could be a moot point because the Ukrainians might well have defeated the Russians operationally, and it just becomes a matter of enforcing an armistice, which the Republicans would be more likely to do.
Yeah. Okay. I heard the theory that it's a possibility, which is probably never been used or maybe used, but very, very seldom, that although Trump is a front runner and will have majority among the contestants for Republican leadership, the leadership convention, Republican leadership convention, sometimes it's going to be July or August next year, they can still reject Trump presidency and give it to somebody else, whoever was maybe in second place or whatever. But again, it's a theory and it's not worth to discuss. Russians are using the tactics that very similar was used in Second World War. That they were just throwing their armies on the enemy's fire. They don't count. Russians don't know how many people they lost in Second World War, and nobody's even trying to account. A lot. 20 million, 27 million, 18 million, as it used to be before. Nobody knows, and nobody cares. So Putin was saying a few months ago, he said something to, okay, here are two alternatives. One, you will fight for your motherland and you'll die there as a hero. Another alternative, no, you're not going to fight for your motherland. You will continue drinking, you'll die from drinking, and nobody will care about you. So, which alternative is better? Just to die from alcohol or to defend your motherland? Of course, the second one, plus 200,000 rubles, which I mentioned before. So the alternative is clear. So Putin has no problem to retain these people who, for 200,000 rubles, are ready to take a chance. And who knows, maybe the war will be over very soon. Who knows, maybe he will not be killed. Or who knows, maybe he will be just maimed, and then he'll go to the hospital. He will try to rebuild his life one way or another. So this is this is really bizarre, and I think that Ukraine, at this point, when we're talking about difficulties of resupply Russian lines with manpower, with soldiers, with weapons, and so on. Maybe all Ukrainians have to do, they don't even need a decisive attack. They have to keep Russians under pressure on all front line and try to save as many of their own lives as possible. And Russians will die simply because of their logistical difficulties. They have to bring food supplies. The soldiers cannot go without food for long, right?
Correct.
So I don't know how they're going to do it. And I know that Russians don't have enough refrigerators because when Ukrainians were attacking in Kiev and Bucha, so the first thing what they were trying to get is refrigerators and washing machines. That's what they needed the most. You understand what kind of army Ukrainians are fighting, right?
Yeah.
It's bizarre. But anyway, Jonathan, I think we were getting a little bit ahead, and I think from what I can measure is that each of our programs is becoming more and more popular, and the
Yeah.
news is getting better and better for us. So, what a great time to be alive!
Exactly.
Exactly.
It
Thank you.
beats the alternative.
Absolutely, Jonathan. Thank you so much for today's program, and have a great week. And we'll see you next time on Tuesday. Next time,
And
same.
hopefully we'll have even better developments to comment on.
I really hope so. Thank you so much. Slava Ukraini. Bye bye.